In the dust-choked town of Red Creek, where the sun seemed to hang in the sky like an unforgiving judge, Eli Turner grew up under the heavy shadow of his father's name. Jeremiah Turner was a man whispered about in saloons and on street corners, an outlaw whose crimes were as infamous as the scars he left on the land. Yet, Jeremiah was a ghost in Eli's childhood, absent more often than present, his reputation haunting Eli like a specter. Eli's earliest memories were framed by the creak of worn floorboards and the sharp scent of gunpowder that lingered in the air. His mother, a woman worn thin by worry and hardship, tried to shield him from the town's harsh judgments, but the whispers followed him like vultures. Children crossed the street to avoid him, adults averted their gaze, and the lawman watched with suspicion rather than welcome. In Red Creek, the son of an outlaw was often condemned before he spoke a word. Despite the weight of his father's legacy, Eli's heart beat with a different rhythm. Where others saw a future carved out by violence and lawlessness, Eli saw a path toward order and honor. From a young age, he studied the stories of men who upheld the law, men whose courage was measured not in bullets fired, but in justice served. He soaked in the lessons his mother recited at night, stories of sheriffs who stood tall against the chaos, their badges gleaming under the harsh sun. The town itself was a place where survival often meant bending the rules or breaking them altogether. Saloon brawls erupted with alarming regularity, and the local gambling halls were fronts for darker dealings. Corruption seeped into the roots of Red Creek like poison, infecting the very men sworn to protect its citizens. It was a place where a man's word was as fragile as the cracked earth beneath their boots, and trust was a currency few could afford. Eli's determination to rise above his father's shadow was not born from naivety, but from a fierce will to change the story that had been written for him. He spent countless hours training with an old retired marshal named Ben Calloway, a man whose hands had once been steady in the heat of gunfights and whose eyes held the wisdom of hard lessons learned. Under Ben's watchful gaze, Eli learned to read the signs of danger, to keep his hand calm when tension rippled through the air, and to carry himself with the quiet authority of a man who believed in something greater than himself. As the years passed, Eli's reputation began to shift, albeit slowly. Neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now nodded with cautious respect when he passed. Yet the shadow of Jeremiah Turner loomed large, a constant reminder that the past was not so easily escaped. Every step Eli took was measured against the legacy of a man who had brought fear to Red Creek, and every victory was tinged with the doubt cast by his father's sins. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of blood red, Eli stood on the porch of his modest home, watching the town's restless streets. The air was thick with tension, a reminder that peace in Red Creek was fragile at best. He knew that choosing a life of law and order in a town built on chaos would not be easy. The path ahead was riddled with challenges, and the weight of his father's past threatened to pull him under. But Eli's resolve was forged from more than just ambition. It was born from the belief that a man could choose his own destiny, that the sins of the father need not dictate the future of the son. With a steady breath, he tightened the grip on the worn leather strap of his belt, feeling the reassuring weight of the badge that would soon mark his commitment. In that moment, beneath the fading light of a troubled sky, Eli Turner made a silent vow to bring law where there was lawlessness, to be a beacon of hope in a town that had long forgotten what hope looked like. The dawn that followed was not just the start of a new day, but the beginning of Eli's journey, a journey that would test his courage, challenge the very fabric of Red Creek, and force him to confront the ghosts of a legacy he was determined to rewrite. As the town stirred awake, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in one young man's heart, Eli took his first steps away from the shadow of his father and into the uncertain light of the law. The weight of his father's name clung to Eli Turner like a second skin, each whispered accusation and sideways glance a reminder of the legacy he struggled to escape. In Red Creek, a man's past was not easily shed, and for Eli the burden was not just the town's suspicion, but the gnawing conflict within himself. The son of Jeremiah Turner, outlaw and menace, was expected to inherit his father's path. Yet Eli's soul wrestled with a different truth. Days bled into weeks as Eli threw himself into the rigorous training that Ben Calloway insisted upon. The retired marshal's lessons were harsh and unyielding, designed not only to sharpen Eli's skill with a revolver, but to steel his spirit against the storms to come. Ben's voice was gravelly, tempered by years of loss and hard-earned wisdom. "Out here, it ain't just about pulling your gun faster," he'd say, eyes narrowing. "It's about knowing when to keep it holstered. Justice is a steady hand, not a quick trigger." Eli absorbed every word, but the town's whispers never ceased. At the general store, the shopkeeper's eyes flickered with distrust when Eli entered. In the saloon, the men who once called Jeremiah a devil muttered warnings under their breath when Eli passed by. Even his fellow lawmen regarded him with suspicion, their respect grudging and measured. The shadow of Jeremiah Turner was long and dark, and Eli knew that earning trust would take more than skill or words. It would require unwavering resolve. Yet beneath the surface of public doubt, Eli's own heart waged a war. He knew the truth about his father's death was buried deep in the town's past, tangled with secrets the powerful wished to keep hidden. Jeremiah had been killed 3 years prior, a violent end that left a scar on Red Creek's memory, but the men responsible had not been brought to justice. Worse still, whispers suggested that they wore badges of their own, sitting comfortably in positions of influence. For Eli, the line between justice and revenge blurred dangerously. Each night, Eli wrestled with the question that haunted him. Should he seek vengeance for the man who had shaped his earliest years in fear and absence, or should he uphold the law impartially, even if it meant protecting the very men who had ended his father's life? The answer was never easy. His mind replayed the harsh lessons of Ben Calloway, who preached restraint and fairness above all else, but the fire of anger burned fiercely, threatening to consume the principles Eli was trying so hard to embody. One evening, as twilight draped the town in muted shadows, Eli found himself standing alone by the edge of the creek that gave Red Creek its name. The water ran cold and relentless, carving its path through the unforgiving land, much like the legacy he wished to reshape. He clenched his fists, the rough calluses of his hands grounding him in the moment. Memories of his father's absence, the town's scorn, and the unanswered questions about the killer's identities surged within him. At that moment, Ben Calloway approached silently, his weathered face etched with concern. "You can't let the past poison your soul, Eli," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. "Justice ain't about settling scores, it's about what's right, even when it's the hardest path to walk." Eli nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of doubt. But what if the law protects the wrong men? What if justice is just another story told by those in power? Ben's eyes met his with unyielding certainty. "Then you make sure the truth sees the light no matter the cost. That's the choice you have to make, not just for you, but for this town." The days that followed tested Eli's resolve like never before. Incidents of lawlessness began to escalate, robberies, brawls that spilled into the streets, and whispers of corrupt dealings among those who wore the badge. Each event was a gauntlet thrown down, challenging Eli's commitment to uphold the law above all else. The town's fragile peace was cracking, and some saw in Eli a chance for real change, while others viewed him as a threat to the established order. Eli's investigations led him deeper into the dark underbelly of Red Creek's power structure. Late nights, spent poring over records, talking to reluctant witnesses, and following shadowy trails brought him closer to uncovering the identities of those who had killed his father, and worse, those who shielded them. Threats began to surface, delivered in the form of anonymous notes slid under his door, ominous silhouettes watching from the shadows, and whispered warnings in the dead of night. Despite the danger, Eli's commitment never wavered. Each challenge only strengthened his resolve to bring justice, not revenge, to Red Creek. He found allies among a few honest townsfolk and fellow deputies who believed in the law's promise of fairness. Together, they began to piece together a web of deceit that reached far beyond what Eli had imagined, implicating men who wielded their power to suppress truth and maintain control. Yet with every step closer to the truth, the risks grew greater. Eli's nights became restless, haunted by the knowledge that those he pursued were watching, waiting, ready to strike if he faltered. The line between protector and target blurred, but Eli understood that backing down was not an option. One night, as the town lay under a moonless sky, Eli stood outside the sheriff's office, the weight of his father's memory heavy on his shoulders. He knew the path he had chosen was fraught with peril, but also that it was the only path that could break the cycle of violence and suspicion that plagued Red Creek. With a steady hand, he lit a lantern and stepped into the darkness, ready to face whatever shadows awaited. The struggle within him, the fight between legacy and justice, vengeance and mercy, was far from over. But Eli Turner was no longer just the son of an outlaw. He was a man determined to forge a new legacy, one lawfully earned and fiercely protected. The uneasy calm in Red Creek shattered with a suddenness that left the town gasping. Night after night, violence spilled into the streets, and lawlessness clawed its way back into every corner. A string of brazen robberies, violent brawls, and shadowy dealings tested Eli Turner's resolve and sharpened the edge of his purpose. The town's fragile peace was unraveling, and Eli knew that the time for cautious steps was over. He had to act, even as the dangers multiplied. Incidents grew in both frequency and severity. The general store was held up in broad daylight, the owner left battered and fearful. Horses were stolen from the stables, disappearing into the dark horizon. Disturbing rumors swirled about a gang operating under the protection of those who should have been upholding the law. Eli's investigations uncovered a tangled web, men who whispered in saloons and met behind closed doors, their influence casting a pall over Red Creek. Eli moved carefully, aware that each inquiry placed him squarely in the crosshairs of those who wanted the past buried. He spent long hours piecing together fragments of information, a name whispered in a darkened alley, a ledger hidden beneath a floorboard, a witness too frightened to speak openly. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that the killers of Jeremiah Turner were not only alive, but entrenched in the town's power structure. Threats followed swiftly. One evening, as Eli rode home beneath the fading light, a bullet zipped past his ear, embedding itself in the worn wooden post nearby. The message was unmistakable: back off or pay a deadly price. But Eli's resolve only hardened. He refused to be cowed by intimidation or fear. The law meant more than his personal safety. It was the fragile thread holding the town together. Allies surfaced, though cautiously and in small numbers. Deputy Sam Granger, a man known for his quiet integrity, offered his support, sharing information and standing beside Eli during tense confrontations. A few townsfolk, tired of living under the shadow of corruption, whispered encouragement and passed along what little they dared to share. Eli knew he couldn't do this alone, but trust was a scarce commodity in Red Creek. One tense afternoon, Eli found himself in the back room of the saloon, face to face with a man known only as Big Jake, a hulking figure whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his rumored ties to the town's clandestine dealings. The air was thick with menace as Jake's cold eyes measured Eli, testing his mettle. "You're poking your nose where it don't belong, Turner," Jake growled, voice low and dangerous. "Best you remember who holds the cards in this town." Eli met his gaze steadily. "I'm here to see that justice is done, no matter who's involved." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the murmur of patrons in the saloon. Jake's sneer deepened. "We'll see about that." The encounter was a stark reminder of the forces arrayed against Eli. Yet it also steeled his determination. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was his commitment to the law. He knew the road ahead would be perilous, but the truth demanded to be uncovered. As days turned to weeks, Eli's investigation brought him closer to the heart of the conspiracy. Documents hidden in the sheriff's office revealed financial transactions linking prominent townsmen to the outlaw gang believed responsible for Jeremiah's death. Witnesses, emboldened by Eli's steadfastness, began to speak, their voices trembling but resolute. But with progress came greater risk. A late-night break-in at Eli's home left his belongings ransacked and his mother shaken. The message was clear: intimidation would not cease until Eli abandoned his quest. Yet the sight of his mother's tear-streaked face only deepened his resolve. This was about more than justice for his father. It was about protecting the future of Red Creek. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eli rode into the outskirts of town, following a tip about a meeting of the outlaw gang. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees, Eli watched as a dozen men gathered around a campfire, their faces shadowed, but unmistakably those he sought. He recognized the leader, a man whose name had surfaced repeatedly in his investigation, a man who wore the guise of respectability by day, but ruled the underworld by night. Eli's hand hovered near his holster, every muscle coiled for action. He knew that this confrontation could change everything. As the men spoke in hushed tones, Eli's mind raced. Arresting them here, in the open desert, would require careful planning and swift action, but more than that, it demanded courage, not just his own, but the courage to face the consequences of exposing the town's darkest secrets. The moment was a crucible, testing Eli's mettle and his commitment to justice. As the firelight flickered across the faces of those who had haunted his past, Eli understood that his pursuit was no longer just a personal mission, it was a battle for the soul of Red Creek. With a steady breath, he prepared to act, knowing that the road ahead was fraught with danger but illuminated by the unwavering light of his resolve. The law was his guide, and he would follow it wherever it led, no matter the cost. The sun had barely risen over Red Creek when Eli Turner found himself face to face with the men who had haunted his every step for years, the men responsible for his father's death. The air was thick with tension, the early morning silence punctuated only by the distant crow of a rooster and the steady pounding of Eli's own heartbeat. The men stood before him, their faces a mixture of defiance, contempt, and, in some eyes, a flicker of recognition. Eli's hand rested just above his holstered revolver, but he did not reach for it. The moment demanded more than a quick draw or a bullet. It demanded the law, and the courage to uphold it even when every fiber of his being screamed for revenge. The men he confronted were not mere outlaws now. They were pillars of the town, men who wielded their power like shields against justice. "What do you want, Turner?" The tallest of the group sneered, his voice dripping with scorn. "You think you can come here and drag us down? Your father's past won't save you." Eli met the gaze steadily, the weight of years pressing down but not breaking his resolve. "I'm here to do what your kind has avoided for too long. To see that justice is served, not vengeance." A murmur ran through the group. One man, older and grayer, stepped forward, his eyes cold but wary. "You're a fool if you think the law will protect you here." But Eli was no longer a boy shadowed by his father's sins. He was a man forged by hardship and tempered by principle. "The law isn't about protecting the powerful, it's about protecting all of us, starting with the truth." The standoff stretched on, the silence thick with unspoken threats and old grudges. Eli could feel the eyes of the townsfolk watching from windows and doorways, their breaths held in anxious anticipation. This was more than a confrontation, it was a reckoning. Then, with deliberate calm, Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn piece of parchment, a ledger he had uncovered during his investigations, its pages stained, but its contents damning. He laid it on the creaking wooden table between them, the names and transactions etched in ink like a map to the town's corruption. "This is the proof," Eli said quietly but firmly. "Your crimes, your lies, they're all here. It's time to answer for what you've done." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if on cue, one of the men stepped back, his jaw clenched, eyes darkening with anger. "You're making a mistake, Turner." But Eli did not waver. Instead, he reached for his badge and held it high, a symbol not just of authority, but of his commitment to justice. "I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Jeremiah Turner and for the crimes you've committed against this town." The tension exploded like a thunderclap. The men exchanged glances, some filled with rage, others with resignation. Eli's hand remained steady on his revolver, ready but unwilling to draw unless absolutely necessary. In that charged moment, an unexpected voice broke through, the voice of one of the accused, a man known for his temper and brutality. "You're just a boy playing at law, Turner. You don't understand what you're up against." Eli's eyes locked with the man's, unflinching. "I understand more than you think. I understand that justice is not about blood for blood. It's about breaking the cycle." The room fell into a heavy silence. The men, hardened by years of violence and power, faced the rare moment of truth. For Eli, it was a test of everything he had learned, from Ben Calloway's lessons to his own struggle between vengeance and fairness. Slowly, one by one, the men lowered their heads, the fight draining from their eyes. They allowed themselves to be handcuffed, their bodies tense but compliant. Eli's choice to uphold the law, rather than succumb to the temptation of revenge, had turned the tide. As the men were led away, the townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places, their expressions a mix of relief, disbelief, and cautious hope. Eli stood tall, the burden of his father's legacy still heavy but no longer a chain. He had faced the darkness and chosen the light. Later, in the quiet of his small home, Eli reflected on what had transpired. The confrontation had been more than a legal victory. It had been a moment of recognition and understanding. The men he had arrested were not monsters beyond redemption, but flawed men who had lost their way. And Eli's choice to arrest rather than kill was a testament to his belief in justice over vengeance. The road ahead would still be difficult, but in that moment, Eli Turner knew he had taken the first true step toward breaking the cycle of violence that had gripped Red Creek for so long. The law he served was not just a badge or a weapon, it was a promise of something better, a hope that could heal wounds older than the town itself. The courtroom in Red Creek was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with anticipation and whispered judgments. Faces from every corner of the town filled the wooden benches, some with hope, others with skepticism, waiting to witness the moment Eli Turner chose to make his faith in justice known to all. The men he had arrested, once feared and untouchable, sat solemnly at the front, their eyes avoiding the crowd, burdened by the weight of their crimes and the unexpected path that had led them here. Eli stood before the gathered townsfolk, his badge gleaming under the harsh sunlight streaming through the dusty windows. The room fell silent as he began to speak, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of years spent wrestling with pain, anger, and the hope for something better. "I stand here today not as the son of an outlaw, but as a man who believes in the law that protects us all, no matter our past," Eli declared, his gaze sweeping across the room. "These men before you have been held accountable for their actions, not because of vengeance, but because justice demands it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging doubtful glances. The legacy of Jeremiah Turner still cast a long shadow, and Eli's decision to forgive publicly stirred a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Eli's voice softened, revealing the depth of his conviction. "I forgive these men, not to erase the pain of the past, but to break the cycle of hatred that has gripped our town for too long. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the strength to heal, to move forward, and to build a future where our children need not bear the burdens we have carried." The courtroom remained hushed, the weight of Eli's words settling like a gentle rain over parched earth. Some eyes glistened with unshed tears, others hardened with resistance, but all were touched by the courage it took to stand there and offer mercy in a place hardened by violence. Outside, the families of the accused watched with mixed emotions. For some, Eli's forgiveness was a balm to wounds long festering. For others, it was an incomprehensible act that challenged their own thirst for retribution. Yet, slowly, conversations began, not of blame, but of understanding. In the days that followed, Eli found himself at the center of a fragile but growing reconciliation. He reached out to the families of those he had arrested, offering not only words, but actions, helping rebuild homes damaged by past conflicts, sharing meals at his table, and listening to stories that humanized even those once seen as enemies. The journey was neither swift nor easy. Some in the community resisted, their fears and prejudices entrenched like stubborn roots. But Eli's example inspired others, especially the youth, who saw in him a living testament to the possibility of change. In quiet moments, he would speak to them beneath the wide-open sky, urging them to choose forgiveness over hatred, justice over vengeance. One afternoon, as he walked through the town square, an elderly woman approached him, her eyes bright despite the years etched on her face. "You've done what many thought impossible, Eli," she said softly. "You've shown us that even the deepest wounds can begin to heal." Eli smiled, the weight of his journey momentarily lifting. "It's not about forgetting the past," he replied. "It's about choosing to write a new story, one where we are not bound by the mistakes of those before us." The transformation in Red Creek was subtle but undeniable. The town, once fractured by suspicion and fear, began to find tentative hope in the possibility of peace. Families who once avoided each other now exchanged greetings. The saloon's brawls became less frequent, replaced by conversations about a shared future. For Eli, the act of forgiveness was deeply personal. It was a rejection of the cycle that had ensnared his father and so many others, a choice to break free and to lead by example. He understood that forgiveness did not erase the past, but it did offer a path forward, one paved with mercy and understanding. As the sun set over Red Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, Eli stood on the porch of his home, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The road had been fraught with pain and peril, but also with moments of profound grace. The legacy he carried was no longer a chain, but a bridge, connecting a troubled past to a hopeful future. In the quiet of the evening, Eli felt a stirring of peace. The battles within him had not vanished, but they had been tempered by the strength of forgiveness. He knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, but with each step, he was forging a new legacy, one defined not by bloodshed, but by the courage to forgive and to heal. Years unfurled over Red Creek like the steady flow of the river that cut through its dusty lands, bringing change with a quiet persistence. Eli Turner, once the son of a notorious outlaw, had grown into a man embodying the ideals he had fought so fiercely to uphold: justice tempered by mercy, strength softened by compassion. His name, once met with suspicion and scorn, now commanded respect and trust throughout the town. The transformation of Red Creek was no accident. The town's streets grew safer, its saloons quieter, its people more willing to embrace hope where once there had been only fear. Eli's efforts had sown seeds of peace that took root in the hearts of those who had long known only conflict. He was no longer just a lawman, he was a symbol of reconciliation, a living testament to the power of forgiveness and integrity. Eli's days were filled with duties as steady as the rising sun. He patrolled the town with a watchful eye, not just to enforce the law, but to guide the restless youth who wandered uncertainly between the shadows of the past and the promise of the future. He spoke to them beneath the sprawling oaks and cracked porches, urging them to choose the path of peace, to break free from the cycles that had ensnared their families for generations. One afternoon, Eli found himself mentoring a young boy named Jesse, whose eyes held the same defiant spark Eli had carried in his youth. Jesse's father had been caught in old grudges, and the boy teetered on the edge of bitterness and hope. Sitting beside the creek, Eli shared stories not only of law and order, but of mercy and second chances. "Your past doesn't have to be your future," Eli told him, his voice steady but kind. "It's what you do with today that counts." The boy nodded, the weight of those words settling into his heart like a balm. Eli's home became a gathering place for the community, a neutral ground where settlers and townsfolk from all walks of life could meet, share meals, and find common ground. The walls, once cold and silent, now echoed with laughter and conversation. Friends from both sides of old divides sat side by side, united by the respect Eli had cultivated through years of unwavering dedication. The memory of his father, Jeremiah Turner, lingered not as a dark shadow but as a reminder of the journey Eli had undertaken. He honored that legacy not by repeating its mistakes, but by forging a new path, one paved with justice and the courage to forgive. Eli's story became intertwined with the town's transformation, a narrative that redefined what it meant to be a Turner. Each year, on the anniversary of the day he confronted the men responsible for his father's death, a quiet tradition took root. The young Comanche girl who had once been a stray in the wind of Eli's youth, now a respected member of her tribe, would visit, sharing a meal with him beneath the open sky. Their bond, forged in moments of kindness and understanding, symbolized the peace that had blossomed between cultures once divided by fear and suspicion. Together they spoke of the past, not to dwell in its pain, but to honor the lessons it taught and the bridges it had built. Their friendship was a testament to the power of compassion to transcend boundaries, a living example of hope for the generations to come. Eli's twilight years were marked by a quiet contentment. Surrounded by friends and family from both the settlers and the Comanche, he lived with the satisfaction of a man who had fulfilled his promise, not just to the law, but to his own heart. The scars of the past remained, but they were softened by the grace of forgiveness and the strength of love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Red Creek, Eli stood on the porch of his home, watching the town he had helped to heal. The laughter of children playing in the street mingled with the gentle murmur of the river, a melody of life renewed. In that moment, Eli Turner understood that true courage did not lie in the quick draw of a gun or the harsh judgment of vengeance. It lived in the quiet acts of mercy, the willingness to forgive, and the steadfast commitment to justice. His legacy was not written in blood, but in the bonds of friendship, the healing of wounds, and the hope that blossomed from the darkest soil. And so, beneath the vast expanse of sky, with the stars beginning to twinkle like distant promises, Eli Turner's story became a beacon, a light guiding Red Creek and its people toward a future where peace was more than just a dream, but a living, breathing reality. If you loved the story, like the video and subscribe.